My name is Julian Marsh. I'm 38 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at our mother's retirement party, my brother Dominic stood up with a drink in his hand and told nearly 40 people, including our mother's entire book club and half our extended family, that I'd never really helped this family with anything real, financially or otherwise, while he'd been the one actually holding things together for years. He didn't know that for the past 15 years, I'd been the one quietly wiring his rent payment directly to his landlord on the first of every month, a fact that existed nowhere in conversation, but existed in exactly 180 consecutive bank transfer records with my name on every single one of them. I didn't say anything at the party. I raised my glass along with everyone else, congratulated our mother, and let the moment pass. I already knew exactly what was sitting in a folder in my desk drawer at home. To understand why I stayed so calm, you need to go back 15 years, to a phone call I got at 2 in the morning from a brother who'd just been evicted, and the quiet decision I made afterward that nobody in my family ever noticed enough to ask about. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word silent in the comments if you've ever carried something heavy for your family without ever once mentioning it out loud. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that retirement party makes sense. Dominic is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, he was the charismatic one, the one who made friends easily, talked his way out of trouble, and generally moved through life with a kind of effortless confidence that I, quieter and more careful by nature, never quite had. I remember him as a teenager talking his way out of a speeding ticket by charming the officer with a story about rushing to see a sick grandmother who, as far as I knew, was in perfectly good health at the time. Our parents adored him for it, in the specific way parents sometimes adore the child who makes a room feel alive just by walking into it. I don't say that with bitterness. It's simply the shape our family took, and for most of our childhood, it didn't bother me much. I found my own footing in quieter ways, building model bridges in the garage with our father, the kind of methodical, structural thinking that would eventually become my career, while Dominic filled every room he entered with a kind of energy I never tried to compete with. Dominic's confidence, though, never translated cleanly into financial stability as an adult. He bounced between jobs in his 20s, sales roles mostly, a stint trying to start his own marketing consultancy that folded within a year, a period working for a friend's startup that went under during a rough economic stretch. Each time he described the setback with the same easy confidence he'd always had, framing it as a stepping stone rather than a crisis, a habit that I think served him well emotionally, but poorly financially, since it meant he rarely built the kind of cushion that might have absorbed a bad month without becoming a genuine emergency. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Denver, a steady, unglamorous career that's paid reliably since I finished my licensing exams in my late 20s. Our financial situations diverged early and never really converged again. The phone call that started all of this came 15 years ago on a Tuesday night just after 2 a.m. Dominic was crying on the other end of the line, something I'd only heard him do once before, at our grandfather's funeral. He'd been evicted from his apartment that day, not a surprise eviction exactly. He later admitted he'd fallen 3 months behind on rent after losing a sales job and hadn't told anyone, hoping he'd find something before it became a real problem. It hadn't worked out that way. He was sitting in his car in a Denny's parking lot with 2 suitcases, genuinely unsure what to do next, too embarrassed to call our parents and admit how bad things had gotten. I drove over that night, helped him find a motel for the week, and sat with him the next morning while we figured out next steps. I want to be honest about the decision I made in the weeks that followed, because I think it's the part of this story people understand least. I didn't lend him a lump sum, and I didn't bail him out in some dramatic one-time gesture. I offered instead to quietly cover his rent directly, paying his landlord myself each month for as long as he needed it, on the condition that he focus on stabilizing his income without the immediate terror of homelessness hanging over every job search. I structured it as a direct wire to whatever landlord he had at any given time, rather than giving him cash. Partly for practical reasons, I wanted to be certain the money actually went toward housing, and partly, if I'm honest, because I didn't want the arrangement to feel like a running tally between us, a debt he owed me that we'd have to awkwardly discuss every month. What I expected to be a temporary bridge, maybe 6 months while he found steady footing, quietly became a permanent arrangement neither of us ever formally revisited. Dominic did eventually stabilize professionally, landing a decent sales position about 2 years after that first phone call, one that paid reasonably well. I want to be honest that at that point, a natural moment existed to end the arrangement, and I didn't take it. Partly because Dominic's income, while steady, never quite covered his expenses the way it should have, a pattern of spending that outpaced his earnings regardless of how much he made, something I recognized but never confronted him about directly, since it felt easier to simply keep the safety net in place than to have a difficult conversation about his financial habits. Partly, too, because by that point the monthly wire transfer had become such an automatic, invisible part of my own financial routine that ending it would have required a conversation neither of us seemed eager to start. Over 15 years, Dominic moved apartment 6 times, 3 different cities as his career took him around. 2 brief periods living with girlfriends where I paused the payments accordingly, and 1 9-month stretch, oddly, where he insisted on paying his own rent entirely, proudly telling our family at the time that he'd finally gotten his finances together, before quietly asking me to resume the arrangement the following spring, after a slow season at work left him short again. I remember that 9-month stretch specifically because our mother had mentioned it proudly at a dinner, holding it up as proof that Dominic had really turned a corner, and I remember smiling and agreeing, genuinely happy for him in that moment, not yet understanding that the corner would prove temporary, or that the story of his self-sufficiency would outlive the actual self-sufficiency by more than a decade. I never once corrected the family narrative during that 9-month gap, or at any other point, because it never occurred to me that the story of who was actually helping our family would eventually be told so differently from what I knew to be true. I set up automatic transfers early on, through my bank's bill pay system, directly to whichever landlord Dominic had at the time, updating the payee information whenever he moved. Every transfer generated a confirmation record, and being the methodical person I am, a habit that serves me well in structural engineering, where a missed calculation isn't a small thing, I kept a simple folder, physical printouts at first and later digital statements, documenting every single payment. Not because I imagined I'd ever need to prove anything to anyone. I think, if I'm honest, I kept the folder the way I keep every important financial record, out of the same careful habit that makes me good at my job, applied without much thought to my personal life as well. What I didn't fully register over those 15 years was how a very different story about our family's financial dynamics had been quietly taking shape around me. Dominic, charismatic as ever, had a way of describing his own life at family gatherings that consistently framed him as the one who'd figured things out, someone who'd built a career the hard way, without anyone's help, while subtly, almost unconsciously, positioning me as the sibling who'd taken the easy, stable path, and therefore had less to be proud of, less real struggle to point to. Our parents, especially our mother, absorbed this framing over the years without ever really questioning it, in part because Dominic told it well, weaving specific, vivid details into his account of overcoming hardship, and in part, I think, because it simply fit a familiar shape they'd always assigned to each of us. Dominic as the resilient one who overcame hardship, me as the fortunate one who never had to. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when Dominic told an extended cousin, in front of the whole table, a detailed story about how he'd clawed his way back from a rough patch entirely on his own savings, describing budgeting spreadsheets and ramen dinners with real specificity, while I sat across the table having personally wired that month's rent to his landlord 4 days earlier. I remember feeling a strange, quiet dissonance in that moment, not quite anger, more a kind of disorientation, watching a story get told with such conviction that it almost made me doubt my own memory of the wire transfer confirmation still sitting in my email inbox. I let this narrative sit largely uncorrected for years, partly out of genuine indifference to who got credit for what, and partly because correcting it would have required explaining the rent payments, which would have required either embarrassing Dominic publicly or making my own quiet generosity sound like something I was doing for recognition, rather than because I loved my brother and didn't want him to end up back in a Denny's parking lot at 2 a.m. Both outcomes felt worse to me than simply letting the story stand uncorrected. The comment that finally made me start reconsidering that choice came about 8 months ago at a family dinner when Dominic, in the middle of describing a rough patch at his current job, said, somewhat pointedly, "It's easy for Julian to judge. He's never had to actually struggle for anything." Our mother nodded along sympathetically. I didn't say anything that night, though something in me noted quietly how far the story had drifted from anything resembling the truth. The retirement party, 5 weeks ago, was meant to celebrate our mother's 31 years as a middle school teacher, a warm, well-attended gathering at a rented event space with nearly 40 guests, colleagues, old friends, extended family, her entire book club dressed in their nicest outfits, several former students now grown who'd shown up specifically to thank her for something she'd taught them decades earlier. It was, for most of the evening, exactly the kind of celebration she deserved after 3 decades of a genuinely demanding career. Dominic gave a toast partway through, warm and genuinely moving for most of it, thanking our mother for her example, her sacrifices, the specific way she'd taught both of us the value of hard work, recounting a story about her staying up late grading papers at the kitchen table while somehow still making it to every one of our school events. The room was warm with affection by that point, several people already reaching for tissues. Then, riding some current of emotion I think he genuinely felt in the moment, he added, gesturing vaguely toward me with his glass, "Not everybody in this family learned that lesson the same way. I've been the one actually holding things together financially for years, helping wherever I could, while some of us never really had to contribute anything real." A few people laughed, uncertain, the way people do when a toast takes an unexpected turn. Our mother glanced at me with something between confusion and mild embarrassment, clearly unsure whether to say something or simply let it pass. I raised my glass along with everyone else, said something forgettable about being proud of both my mother and my brother, and let the moment pass, the way I'd let dozens of similar moments pass over the years. I didn't mention the wire transfers, the 15 years of rent payments, the folder sitting in my desk drawer at home documenting every single one. I just stood there, holding information my brother apparently had no memory of, or had simply decided didn't count, in a room full of people who now believed a version of our family's story that had never once made room for what I'd actually been doing. I want to say clearly that I didn't leave that party plotting some grand reveal. I've never been the kind of person who enjoys public confrontation, and some part of me still hoped, even after 15 years of silence, that I could simply continue letting it go. What changed things wasn't anything dramatic. It was a conversation with my wife, Priya, 2 days after the party, when she asked me, gently, over dinner, why I'd let Dominic's comment stand without saying anything, and I found myself for the first time genuinely unable to explain my own silence in a way that made sense even to me. "You've been paying his rent for 15 years, she said, setting down her fork. "That's not nothing, Julian. That's not never contributing anything real. I don't understand why you keep letting him tell people the opposite, especially in front of the whole family, at your own mother's celebration." I didn't have a good answer. I sat with her question for several days, turning it over during my commute, during quiet moments at work, before I finally called Dominic myself, not to ambush him, but because I realized I genuinely wanted to understand why the story had drifted so far from what I knew to be true, and whether he actually believed the version he'd been telling, or simply found it convenient. "Dominic," I said when he picked up, "I need to ask you something honestly. Do you actually not remember the rent payments? Or did you just decide at some point that they didn't count as real help?" There was a long pause on the line. "What rent payments?" I want to be honest that his response genuinely stunned me, more than I expected it to. 15 years, Dominic, since the eviction. I've been wiring your rent directly to your landlords this whole time. I have every single transfer documented." The silence that followed was long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "I thought," he started, then stopped. "I thought that was just like a loan early on. I paid you back for that, didn't I? I thought that ended years ago." "You paid me back for about 4 months, once, 9 years ago, before asking me to resume a few months later," I said. "The rest of it, 180 payments, I never once mentioned again because I didn't think it needed announcing. I did it because I loved you and didn't want you back in that Denny's parking lot. I didn't do it for credit. But I'm not going to keep sitting quietly while you tell our entire family I've never contributed anything real." Dominic was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, less certain than I'd heard it in years. "I genuinely didn't remember it being that much, or that recent. I think I told myself a story a long time ago where I'd gotten myself back on my feet completely on my own, because that felt better than the alternative. I think somewhere along the way I actually started believing my own version of it, the way you do when you tell a story enough times. I'm sorry, Julian, I don't know what else to say right now except that." I asked him, honestly, whether some part of him had genuinely forgotten, or whether it was easier to simply not think too hard about where the money had actually been coming from each month. He was quiet for a while before answering. "I think it's both, if I'm being fully honest. The first year or two, I knew exactly what was happening, and I was grateful, genuinely. But somewhere after that, I think not thinking about it became easier than sitting with what it meant about me, that I still needed help, years into what I was telling everyone was a comeback story. It was simpler to just stop noticing." I told him I appreciated the honesty, and that I wasn't looking for a dramatic apology or a public correction at some future family gathering, just an acknowledgement, privately, of what had actually happened over these 15 years. He asked, quietly, whether I wanted him to keep paying me back somehow, some structured repayment plan, and I told him honestly that wasn't the point. "I never wanted repayment," I said. "I wanted you to stop telling people I never helped, when the truth is I've been helping every single month for 15 years, without you even fully realizing it." 5 weeks have passed since that retirement party. Dominic told our mother the full story about 2 weeks after our phone call, sitting her down privately rather than making it a public spectacle, which I appreciated. She called me that evening, her voice thick with something between guilt and disbelief. 15 years, Julian? Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I didn't think it needed saying," I told her. "I still don't, entirely. I just needed it to stop being the version of the story everyone believed." She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said something that surprised me. "I think I always assumed you two had it easier with each other than you actually did. I think I built a story in my head, a long time ago, about which of my sons needed watching and which one didn't, and I never once went back to check if that story was still true. She asked if she could see the folder of transfer records herself, not out of doubt, she clarified, but because she wanted to understand the actual shape of what I'd been carrying quietly for so long. I mailed her copies the following week. She's been different with me since, in small, quiet ways, asking more genuine questions about my own life, my own struggles, in a way she hadn't in years, as though the discovery had prompted her to actually look at me clearly for the first time in a long while, rather than through the familiar shorthand she'd relied on for decades. Dominic and I have talked more in the past 5 weeks than we had in the previous 2 years combined. Careful, honest conversations that feel different from anything we've had before, less performative, more real. I think about that retirement party sometimes, standing there with my glass while my brother described me as someone who'd never contributed anything real to this family. I don't feel real anger toward him, even now. I think Dominic genuinely needed, for his own sense of dignity, to believe he'd overcome his struggles entirely on his own. And I think that need slowly rewrote his memory of the last 15 years into something more flattering, not out of malice, but out of an ordinary human instinct to be the hero of your own story, rather than someone who needed quiet, consistent rescuing for over a decade. I've thought too about my own role in letting that rewritten story stand for as long as it did. I could have corrected it at any one of a dozen family dinners, any one of Dominic's confident retellings of his own comeback, and I chose silence instead, partly out of genuine humility and partly, I've come to realize, out of a stubborn hope that eventually someone would simply notice on their own. 15 years is a long time to wait for a question nobody thought to ask. I don't think that makes the silence a mistake exactly, but I do think it's worth acknowledging that quiet generosity, left uncorrected long enough, can quietly curdle into its own kind of erasure, one I participated in by never once speaking up. Priya has been a steady presence through all of this, and I've thanked her more than once for asking the question that finally cracked something open in me. I just didn't understand why you'd let him talk over 15 years of your own kindness, she said to me recently, when all you had to do was say one true sentence. I think she's right, though I also think there's something in me that will always find silence easier than confrontation, a tendency I'm trying, slowly, to examine rather than simply accept as an unchangeable part of who I am. If you're watching this and you've ever carried something heavy for someone you love, silently, for years, only to watch them rewrite the story of who actually held things together, I want you to hear this, because I spent 15 years believing my silence was a kindness, and I'm no longer entirely sure that was true. Quiet generosity doesn't stop being real just because nobody's counting it. Sometimes the truth is sitting in a folder of bank transfers somewhere, ordinary and undramatic, 180 records deep, waiting patiently for the moment you finally decide it's allowed to matter. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you quietly supported someone in your family and never got the credit for it. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman whose parents told the whole family she'd walked away from them. 300 handwritten letters later proving she'd never stopped trying to reach them at all.